Here's a question that might stop you cold. When was the last time Ford's British engineers were truly left alone to design a big family saloon entirely on their own terms, with no interference from Dearborn, no corporate diktat from across the Atlantic, and no pressure to mirror whatever was rolling off the line in Detroit? The answer is 1962, and the car is the Ford Zephyr Mk3. Now, if you're the sort of person who remembers these roads before the motorway network swallowed everything whole, you'll recall exactly what Britain looked like at the start of that decade. The austerity of the 1950s had finally begun to lift. Harold Macmillan had told the country it had never had it so good, and while that was open to debate, there was no denying that more families than ever before were getting behind the wheel for the first time. The motor industry was booming, new roads were being built, petrol was still cheap, and Ford of Dagenham, not Ford of Detroit, was right in the middle of it all. The Zephyr was already a name with history behind it. The Mark I had introduced the concept of a proper big family Ford back in 1951. The Mark II had refined it through the later part of that decade. But the Mk3, launched in the spring of 1962 at the Geneva Motor Show, was something different. It was bolder, wider, more ambitious. And critically, it was still entirely a British creation, designed, engineered, and built at Dagenham by men who understood the British road and the British buyer. What this program is about is understanding why that matters, because when the Mark IV arrived in 1966 to replace it, the world had changed. Ford had centralized its European design operation. The influence of Detroit was unmistakable, and for many people who remember both cars, something had been quietly lost. So let us spend some time with the Mark III, the last big Ford that Britain truly built for itself. Section 1. The design, a British car with American ambitions. The Zephyr Mk3 was styled under the direction of Colin Neal, working within Ford's Dunton design studio in Essex. And what the team produced was a car that looked, to 1962 eyes, genuinely impressive. It was wider and lower than the Mk2 it replaced. The body had a cleaner, more sculpted appearance, with a roofline that swept back in a manner that owed something to American styling trends of the late 1950s, but translated them into something that still felt appropriate for a British car on British streets. Perhaps the most immediately striking change from the Mark II was the front end. The Mark III adopted a 4-headlamp layout, at a time when that arrangement still conveyed a sense of modernity and purpose. It read as forward-thinking without crossing into outright excess. The rear fins that had characterized the Mk2 were toned down considerably, giving the Mk3 a cleaner tail that has aged rather better than many of its contemporaries. The whole car sat on a monocoque body, no separate chassis, which helped keep weight in check and gave the structure good rigidity for its class. The wheelbase was slightly longer than the Mark II, and the interior benefited from the increased width. For a family of 4 or 5, this was a genuinely spacious car, by the standards of its time. What the design team achieved, working with the resources available to a British operation in the early 1960s, was a car that looked like it cost more than it did. That was no small accomplishment. Section 2. The range, Zephyr 4, Zephyr 6, and Zodiac. The Mark III was not a single model, it was a range, and understanding the distinctions between its 3 variants tells you a great deal about how Ford read the British market in 1962. At the entry point sat the Zephyr 4, powered by a 1,703 cubic centimeter 4-cylinder engine, producing around 62 brake horsepower. This was the practical workhorse of the range. It was the version aimed squarely at buyers who needed the space and the practicality of a big Ford, but who were watching the pounds carefully. Fleet buyers found it attractive. So did families who had recently stepped up from a smaller car and wanted something with presence without committing to the running costs of a 6. Then came the Zephyr 6, the car that for most people represented the sweet spot of the range. The engine here was a 2,553 cubic centimeter inline 6-cylinder unit, producing in the region of 85 brake horsepower. This was a notably smoother proposition than the 4. The 6-cylinder Ford unit had been around since the Mark I days and had been progressively developed. By the time it appeared in the Mark III, It was a well-understood, broadly reliable engine that mechanics across the country knew how to work on. The Zephyr 6 was the choice for men who covered serious mileage and wanted the comfort and refinement of a larger engine without stepping up to the full cost of the Zodiac. And then there was the Zodiac, the flagship. On paper, it used the same 2,553 cubic centimeter 6 as the Zephyr 6, but in higher states of tune, developing around 109 brake horsepower. Beyond the engine, the Zodiac brought additional equipment as standard that was genuinely luxurious by the measure of its era. Two-tone paintwork options, a more comprehensive instrument panel, better upholstery, and a level of standard equipment that positioned it firmly against more expensive opposition from other British manufacturers. Road tests of the period noted the Zodiac's relaxed high-speed cruising ability and the surprising degree of comfort the suspension managed to provide. Given that British roads in 1962 were not always as smooth as drivers might have wished. Section 3. How it drove. The honest assessment. There is a temptation, when writing about cars of this era, to be either uncritically nostalgic or unnecessarily harsh. Neither approach serves an audience that actually drove these vehicles. So let us be straightforward. The Zephyr Mk3 was not a sports car. It was not designed to be. What it was designed to be was a comfortable, capable, relatively spacious family saloon that could cover ground at a reasonable pace without exhausting its driver or its passengers. Contemporary road tests, including assessments published in Autocar and Motor during 1962 and 63, gave the Zodiac a 0 to 60 time in the region of 13 to 14 seconds. The Zephyr 6 was a few seconds behind that. By the standards of 1962, these were respectable numbers for a car in this class. You were not buying a Zephyr to embarrass sports cars at traffic lights. You were buying it because you needed to get from London to Edinburgh in relative comfort, or because your firm needed a smart, reliable company car that didn't cost the earth to run. The steering was of the recirculating ball variety, not particularly sharp by the standards of a smaller car, but geared appropriately for relaxed, long-distance driving. The suspension independent at the front, with a live rear axle, absorbed the variable surfaces of the British road network with reasonable composure. It was not sophisticated by European standards of the time, but it was not embarrassing either. Fuel consumption for the Zephyr 6 and Zodiac was, in typical period driving, generally recorded in the mid to upper 20s of miles per gallon. For a car of this size, with this level of power, that was acceptable, particularly when you recall that petrol prices in the early 1960s were a fraction of what they would later become. The gearbox on early cars was a 3-speed column change unit, and this attracted some criticism at the time from drivers accustomed to sportier machinery. A 4-speed floor change option was available on the Zodiac, and became an option more widely across the range. Automatic transmission was also offered, and a number of buyers, particularly those using the Zodiac as a prestige company car, took that route. Section 4. The market who bought it, and why. The Zephyr Mk3 sold into a market that was changing rapidly. By 1962, car ownership in Britain had grown substantially compared to even 5 years earlier. The hire purchase system had opened up car buying to a new layer of the population. The motorway network, still in its early stages, had begun to shift the thinking around what a family car needed to do. Sustained high-speed cruising had become a practical consideration in a way it simply hadn't been in the 1940s. Ford pitched the Zephyr directly at the upper middle of the market, above the Cortina and Anglia that served the mass market, but below the genuinely premium territory occupied by Rover or Jaguar. It was, in the language of the day, a car for professional men, senior managers, company directors of smaller firms, doctors, solicitors, and the substantial fleet market that the large corporations and government departments represented. The police forces of England and Wales were also significant customers. The Zephyr 6 and Zodiac had been used by police forces since the Mark I days, and the Mark III continued that tradition. The combination of internal space, mechanical straightforwardness, and adequate performance made it a logical choice for patrol work. If you were driving in Britain in the early 1960s and saw a large Ford in your mirror, there was a reasonable chance it was wearing a blue lamp. Section 5. Production numbers and commercial reality. Ford of Dagenham produced the Zephyr Mk3 range from 1962 through to 1966, when it was replaced by the substantially different Mark IV. Across the 4 years of production, total output across all three variants ran to well over 170,000 units, though precise breakdowns between the Zephyr 4, Zephyr 6, and Zodiac have varied somewhat across different sources. The Zephyr 6 accounted for the largest portion of that figure, as one would expect given its position as the balanced choice in the range. The Zodiac, priced higher and positioned more exclusively, represented a smaller but commercially important share. Export sales also contributed to the production total. The Zephyr and Zodiac were sold in Commonwealth markets. Australia in particular had a strong appetite for large British Fords, and a number of European markets took the cars as well, though in smaller volumes. What this means in practical terms is that the Mark III was, by the standards of its segment, a genuine commercial success for Ford of Dagenham. It validated the decision to offer three variants under a coherent styling umbrella, and proved that British buyers at this level of the market responded well to a car that looked substantial without being ostentatious. Section 6. The problems, an honest account. No car of this era was without its weaknesses, and an audience with direct experience of these vehicles deserves honesty about them. Corrosion was a persistent issue with the Mark III, as it was with virtually every British car of the era. The underbody and inner sill sections were particularly vulnerable, and cars that spent their lives in the wetter parts of the country could develop serious rust problems within a relatively few years of leaving the showroom. This is one of the primary reasons that genuinely good surviving examples are significantly less common than the original production numbers might suggest. The column gear change on early cars was an acquired taste, and some drivers never acquired it. Those who wanted a more positive gear selection often found themselves reaching for the optional floor-mounted 4-speed or simply opting for the automatic. Oil consumption from the 6-cylinder engine, while not unusual by the standards of the time, was something that owners needed to monitor. Regular maintenance properly observed kept the engine reliable, but neglect was punished more severely than it might be by a more modern unit. The braking system on the Zephyr 6 and early Zodiacs was all drum, which attracted comment even in 1962 as disc brakes began to appear on performance cars and some mainstream saloons. Front discs were eventually made available on the Zodiac and became standard fitment later in the production run, but the early cars required more anticipation and planning at speed than drivers accustomed to disc brake machinery might have expected. Section 7. Values, then and now. When the Zephyr Mk3 range was new, it was priced as a serious investment for a British family. The Zephyr 4 entered the market at a price that positioned it as a step above mass-market motoring. The Zephyr 6 cost a meaningful amount more, and the Zodiac fully equipped was genuinely expensive for its time, competing with rivals that commanded considerable respect in their own right. Today, the picture is quite different from other classic Fords of the era. The Mark III range has never attracted the auction premiums that an equivalent-era Cortina Lotus or GT40 might command. For much of the past few decades, good Mark III Zephyrs and Zodiacs have been quietly sought out by knowledgeable buyers who appreciate the combination of period style, practicality, and relative scarcity of well-preserved examples without the inflated prices that accompany more fashionable machinery. A genuinely excellent, unrestored Zodiac Mark III in good original condition will attract serious interest from the right buyers. Restoration quality cars structurally sound, with good bodywork, represent a project with genuine appeal for those who understand what they're looking at. The market for these cars is not large, but it is loyal, and it has a depth of knowledge behind it. Section 8. The end of an era. Why the Mark IV changed everything. The Ford Zephyr Mark IV arrived in 1966, and from the moment it appeared in the showrooms, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. The styling was more overtly American-wide, low, with a character that owed more to the design thinking being exported from Dearborn than to anything that had come from Dunton. Opinions differed at the time, and they still do among enthusiasts today. Some found the Mk3 impressive. Others felt it had lost the specifically British character that had made the Mk3 and its predecessors feel like cars that belonged to their time and place. What is not in dispute is that the Mk3 represented the point at which Ford's European design operations began to be integrated more deliberately into the corporation's global structure. The days of Dagenham doing things its own way, with its own team, responding to the specific demands of British roads and British buyers, were drawing to a close. The Mk3 was not a bad car, but it was a different kind of car. And by the time it arrived, the Mk3 had already been making that same journey north to Edinburgh, carrying salesmen and doctors and police officers and families on holiday for 4 quiet, capable, typically British years. The Ford Zephyr Mk3 was never a car that demanded your attention with extravagance or performance figures. It did not ask to be noticed. What it offered instead was something that has arguably become rarer and more valuable as the decades have passed. A car built by people who knew their customers, knew their roads, and knew their market, and who designed accordingly. For the men who drove these cars in period, and for the sons who remember them on the family driveway, the Mk3 represents something specific about early 1960s Britain. It was a country beginning to move again, beginning to believe in itself again, and Ford of Dagenham was part of that story. The fact that so few good Mk3 survive today is, in its own way, a comment on how hard these cars worked. They were not garage ornaments. They were driven. They covered mileage. They served their purpose thoroughly and without complaint. The ones that remain are the survivors of that working life, and they deserve the attention of anyone serious about understanding what British motoring looked like in that brief, particular window before everything changed. If you knew these cars, if you rode in one as a child, if your father drove one, if you owned one yourself, we would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. The kind of knowledge that comes from actually living with a car cannot be looked up in a reference book, and it matters. If this program has been of interest to you, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps more people find this kind of content, and it tells us that this approach, careful, unhurried, respectful of the facts, is worth continuing. Thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next one.